Week 6, Thinking Out Loud, Lecture 2.2. All the world's a stage, from the Greeks through Shakespeare to Man and Superman. In 1516, when Sir Thomas More wrote his classic and eponymous novel, Utopia, he coined a term that had been and may forever remain in dispute and subject to confusion. In fact, there is no such word as utopia. The Greek words were either utopia, which means not place, or eutopia, which means good place or true place. And then there's dystopia, which definitively means bad place. More left the O and the E off of the word, coining utopia to leave it as ambiguous as most people think it is. He left off the defining vowels, O or E, so that readers of this well-camouflaged description of an encounter between Europeans and North American indigenous peoples could make up their own minds if the world he described was truly desirable or not. A powerful argument can be made that in context, humanity as a whole isn't as far away from utopia as we might think. The insights of Yuval Harari, Sapiens, Homo Deus, 21 Lessons from the 21st Century, and Robert Wright, The Evolution of God, suggest that there has actually been more progress than regression in the pursuit of a better world, despite media to the contrary. But it takes deep deconstruction in context to see where the springboards are and where the pitfalls are. This lecture looks at the world stage and suggests that while individual movements and locations may have missed their mark, the world system as a whole has assimilated and incorporated best practices and elements that make it ever more likely sustainability can and will occur at the macro scale. Storytelling through literature and theatrical performance have been venerable ways of thinking out loud about the human condition. And while utopian literature did not exist strictu sensu among the ancient Greeks, says Rosanna Lariola on page 111, many of the playwrights used their theatrical medium to challenge the status quo and posit improvements through the use of imagination. Aristophanes, the most prolific of the playwrights, used this trope several times, writing works for public performance in corrupt post-Peloponnesian War Athens, in which, quote, the protagonist of the play, the so-called comic hero, devises a fantastic plan which proves the poet's inexhaustible imagination. To give a few examples, both of the unlimited imagination that determines the comic plot and of its link with the current reality, when the war has become tiresome and intolerable and the civic assembly did not want to listen to the good reasons for making peace, Decapolis, one of the best-known Aristophanic heroes, makes a private treaty with the enemy in the comedy Acarnanians, and Trigius, another well-known Aristophanic hero, flies to heaven on a beetle in order to free and bring down on earth the goddess Peace that has been imprisoned by war in the comedy Peace. Then both heroes celebrate the achieved peace with a banquet characterized by abundance of tasty dishes and wine, which recall the motif of the land of plenty. As such, indeed, the prospective world at peace is pictured. If Athens itself has become tiresome, Paisteros and Euripides, the other main Aristophanic characters, decide to run away and build a new city in the sky, which is then celebrated through an abundant banquet as well in the comedy Birds. And if the living poets are inadequate, incapable of providing Athenian people with inspirational and educative plays, Dionysus, another Aristophanic protagonist, undertakes a trip into the underworld in order to find and take back an old poet in the comedy Frogs. These very few and concise examples of Aristophanes' plots shows a utopian tone in that the alternative plan for overcoming the problem and reaching a perfect status belongs to the realm of the imagination, and nowhere, that is utopia with a U, can it be realized. End quote, Lariola, page 116. Lariola distinguishes between utopias of reconstruction and utopias of escape, and says, quote, Plato's res publica, which is regarded as the unquestionable ancient example of utopia, the way in which utopia is conceived, starting from Thomas More, belongs to the utopias of reconstruction, page 112. When I was studying utopian literature in college, Plato's Republic was the first work we were asked to explore. And then we were asked to look at More's Utopia from 1516, Description of the Republic of Christianopolis by Johannes Valentinus, Andre, 1619, The City of the Sun by Tommaso Campanella, 1602. New Atlantis by Francis Bacon, 1627. Nova Salima, The Ideal City by Samuel Gott, circa 1649. The Law of Freedom in a Platform by Gerard Winstanley, 1652. Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, 1888. News from Nowhere by William Morris, 1890. Freeland, Social Anticipation by Theodore Herzka, 1891. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells, 1905. Herland by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, 1915. On up, of course, to the more contemporary works Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner and Ecotopia by Ernst Callenbach. There's a lot of them. And as a student dreaming of creating a real utopia, I dutifully purchased every piece of utopian literature I could find in used bookstores in London on the first leg of my Harvard Michael C. Rockefeller Fellowship year, quote, to explore cultures not my own, end quote. Packed them into a huge suitcase and took them on an airplane to Borneo so I could spend the year I was in the deep primary rainforest studying orangutan behavior at Harvard's Gunung Paling Research Camp, reading them by kerosene lamp in my hut at night, and trying to figure out how we could make the best elements of this great tradition come true. My conclusion was to use biomimicry to design a city with the biodiversity and complexity of a rainforest or coral reef. And I wrote a letter to Professor Skinner at Harvard outlining my hypothesis and received a very warm and encouraging reply from him a few months later. This was in 1985, before we had the internet, and it took 5 weeks each way for letters to get to and from the US. Encouraged by Dr. Skinner's reply, I set about making the realization of utopia my primary life and career goal. What one discovers when one becomes a student of utopia is that people have indeed been thinking about it forever, and may have been thinking about it out loud in ways that used every medium available to them in their time. Shakespeare himself wrote not just tangentially about the quest for utopia, but devoted an entire play to it in 1610, The Tempest, in which shipwrecked Europeans on a tropical island must confront much different ways of seeing the world and living when they encounter Caliban, the local savage, who isn't as savage as Europeans might think. As the SparkNotes website points out, the value of a Western education in being civilized was greatly questioned by indigenous people from the beginning. Quote, Caliban spits out these angry words in response to Miranda's self-satisfied claim in Act 1 that as a savage, he should be grateful for the education she gave him. Caliban implies that he has, in fact, gained nothing of real value from this European education. Given that he has been stripped of all meaningful agency, the only thing he can do with his captor's language is express just how much he despises them. I'll show thee the best springs, I'll pluck thee berries, I'll fish for thee and get thee wood enough. A plague upon the tyrant that I serve. I'll bear him no more sticks, but follow thee, thou wondrous man. Chapter 2, verse 2. Schoolworkhelper.net, a website for helping students analyze texts, puts this reading in context, saying, quote, throughout history, the interaction between civilized people and native islanders has caused confusion and turmoil for cultures. In The Tempest, William Shakespeare portrays the character Caliban as a savage, horrid beast, and as the slave of the Westerner, Prospero. Through Prospero's ownership, Shakespeare views Caliban as a lesser being. Prospero symbolizes the Western power dominating an island and its inhabitants, while Caliban represents the islander who is forcefully controlled by the Westerner. On the surface, Shakespeare's interpretation of Caliban seems racist and stereotypical, but underneath, Caliban represents the falsified image of the Caribbean people. We have to imagine that throughout history, the failings of human experiments in civilization caused such extreme injustice and suffering that people had to express their thoughts about it whenever and wherever possible. We know that Thomas More, whose book coined the term utopia, was beheaded for his insistence on discussing alternatives to the political status quo. It took considerable courage to describe one's imaginings about a better life in public out loud. Such heresy was better kept to yourself. The fact that so many of you don't actively express your thoughts about how to improve our lives in public or challenge the status quo with imaginative possibilities is testimony to this legacy of violence and fear-mongering that has cut short or negatively impacted the lives of so many who dared to think outside the box. What is salient here is the idea that, paradoxically, even those who did the killing and oppressing throughout history somehow felt they were the hero in the quest for utopia, and that the status quo was actually somebody's idea for how to make the world better, and at least for them. Nazi ideology stemmed from a misreading of the utopian writers and philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Thomas Mann, and Martin Heidegger. George Bernard Shaw wrote his 1903 play Man and Superman to help explore these issues in public, saying things like, quote, "Not that I disclaim the fullest responsibility for his opinions and for those of all my characters, pleasant and unpleasant. They are all right from their several points of view, and their points of view are, for the dramatic moment, mine also." This may puzzle the people who believe that there is such a thing as an absolutely right point of view, usually their own, end quote. Shaw loved to point out the paradox of progress toward utopia, saying, quote, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man," end quote. As we mine the works of utopian thinkers throughout history, we keep returning to that paradox that Aristophanes talked about and more enshrined in the ambiguous spelling he used for utopia, that it remains an unfulfilled no place, precisely because we can't seem to ever get everybody to agree on what it should be. Yet we have to pursue it. As Oscar Wilde famously quipped in 1891 in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, quote, "A map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth even glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and, seeing a better country, sets sail. Progress is the realization of utopias." Every semester, I ask my students to write or create some manifested out loud thought of what utopia means to them. We call it our My Utopia exercise. And I'll end with my own idea of what utopia could be, which I composed and recorded as a song, and which my PCGS student John Quinlivan edited imagery to for us. The music for this came to me in a dream in the summer of 2014 in Germany. I had to get out of bed at 4 a.m. and pick up the guitar and find the chords. The lyrics took final shape on the anniversary of our tragedy of 9/11, inspired by the book I used for my Manhattan honors class, Echo Cities, by Richard Register, and my challenge to my students in our Utopia curriculum to write creatively about how their utopias would look. This is an outgrowth of a program Byron DeLear and I ran in an inner city school in LA in the 1990s when we made the Utopia Deep House record album. The lyrics are... Turn the farms to forests and fields. Throw the grains out from our meals. Turn to trees to grow our yields. Start with food to make love real. Turn our food waste back to food. Turn our garbage into fuel. When we kill, do not be cruel. Love your neighbor, be no fool. And I dream of a better world, not a different world, not a different land or people. Dream of a better time, free of war and crime, free of all disease and suffering. Dreams, we can make them real, we can help and heal. That's the world in my utopia. One more word about singing. Charles Darwin wrote in The Descent of Man that singing in humans most likely evolved in the context of reproductive fitness through sexual selection. We know that birds sing to establish territory and increase mating fitness, and when you listen to Paul McCartney and Wings sing, you think that people would have had enough for silly love songs. Well, I look around me and I see it isn't so, and what's wrong with that? We know that it still serves that function today. However, in human history, singing and poetry and rhyming schemes were also used as mnemonic devices, with melody acting as a carrier wave for the information contained in the lyrics. In Shakespeare's time, bards and minstrels traveled the land with their lutes, acting as singing newspapers. In slave times in the Americas, the Negro spiritual used singing as one of the main ways of transmitting vital messages of resistance and hope, so people could keep their spirits up and organize and fight against the injustice. Folk songs were used in the 1960s along with defiant rock and roll to transform consciousness and resist the Vietnam War. So music and rhyming lyrics are powerful ways to think out loud about improvements to the human condition and should be a part of your portfolio of sustainability tactics. Now, for those who don't sing, spoken word works well, using rhythm, if not explicit rhyme, to inject the message with emotional impact. Charlie Chaplin, in his 1940 political satire, The Great Dictator, created a classic spoken word polemic and composed uplifting music to it that can almost bring you to tears. The dream of utopia in this piece of art is palpable today. Martin Luther King Jr. took the art to an even higher level in his unforgettable "I Have a Dream" speech. And today's spoken word artist Prince Ia haunts us with his eloquence in "I'm Sorry." No matter how you do it, the essence of thinking out loud for a better tomorrow is to find a way to connect emotionally with your audience and transmit important and hopefully factual information in a way that grabs people's attention and sticks in their memory. The invention of language, spoken language and body language, dance and gesture and singing, music and art all gave humanity a special ability to make the world more wonderful than even the way we found it, enabling collective action and the creation of civilization. If things aren't great, it isn't because they can't be, but because not enough of us have put our thinking out there for consideration. So consider that and start thinking out loud.